My name is Isabella Mercer, 31 years old. The house looked exactly like I remembered. Pristine, polished, a mausoleum of memory, dressed up as home. Mom had kept it like a museum ever since Grandpa passed a year ago, but now there were Claire's touches scattered everywhere, little fingerprints of intrusion. A glass sculpture in the foyer, gaudy faux marble mirror in the hallway, scented candles that smelled like overpriced hotels, and the Lexus parked arrogantly in the driveway. She didn't even park in the street like a guest anymore. I should have known something was off when Dad insisted on dinner, insisted it was just a casual Tuesday meal. Mom set the table like it was Thanksgiving. She even pulled out the good silverware, the ones polished and tucked away for VIPs. There were no VIPs, just us. Or maybe they thought I was the important one this time. That was their first mistake. Dinner was stilted from the first bite. Claire and Darren sat side by side on the far end, like they owned the place already. Mom chattered about how grown-up Claire had become, her head for business. Darren raised his glass like he was already celebrating. Dad hardly ate, just watched me with that familiar expression, the one he wore before every lecture. I stayed quiet, listened, waited. The meat was overcooked, the potatoes lumpy. The tension was undercooked. Then, Dad set down his napkin, cleared his throat, and smirked. "Your sister's the new owner of this property," he announced. "You have 30 hours to get your things out." That was it. No build-up, no apology, no discussion. Claire didn't even fake surprise. She wore that same tight-lipped smile she'd had since childhood, the one she used when she snitched and got away with it. Darren lifted his glass higher, smug, like a man toasting at a coronation. I smiled too, calm, easy, the kind of smile that didn't match the moment at all. Because here's the thing. Grandpa didn't trust any of them. Not Dad, not Mom, and certainly not Claire. That's why he left everything to me. The house, the land, the savings, all of it. He knew I'd protect it. And for a while I did. I paid the taxes, managed the mortgage, quietly settled his old debts. No one noticed. Because in this family, I didn't exist unless they needed something. Last year, Claire came to me with tears in her eyes. Said she wanted to help with the property. Said she finally appreciated the family legacy. I knew she was lying, but I let her think she was clever. I signed a few papers, gave her just enough access to feel powerful. What she never realized was that the moment she started spending Grandpa's money like it was hers, I started pulling back. Silently. One by one, I let go of the lifelines. I canceled the umbrella insurance she never knew existed, revoked automatic payments, stopped covering the maintenance contracts. I watched the red letters pile up behind the scenes, and I waited. Waited for this moment, for her to sit there, smug and radiant, believing she'd won. The next morning, Claire strutted into the bank like she was about to sign autographs. She wore heels she couldn't walk in, a crisp white blazer still tagged under the sleeve. Darren trailed a step behind, chest puffed like he was her bodyguard. She thought it was a victory lap. She thought the meeting was a ribbon cutting. She thought she'd walk out with confirmation that her new title as owner was official. Instead, she was handed a folder of overdue payment notices, insurance lapse warnings, property taxes flagged red, old liens tied to repairs, and at the bottom, a warning. Unless the outstanding balance of nearly $49,000 was settled immediately, the property would move toward foreclosure review. The story reached me in pieces, through my lawyer, through a friend at the bank, and finally through the frantic calls that started flooding my phone that afternoon. 4 missed calls from Claire, a string of snide texts from Darren, and Mom's voicemail, clipped and cold. "Bella, I don't know what's happening, but your sister's at the bank and they're saying things that don't make sense. Can you call me back?" Not concern, not warmth, just a mother scrambling because her golden child was rattled. I didn't return the call. That evening, Claire finally got through. She didn't say hello, didn't breathe. She launched straight into accusations, how I'd set her up, hidden the truth about the house, let her take the fall. I didn't argue, I just reminded her. She wanted ownership. She insisted. She pushed it with Dad's backing, without even telling me. If she didn't understand what ownership meant, that wasn't my problem. She hung up. An hour later, she posted a blurry wine glass on Instagram with a caption about betrayal and snakes in the grass. The comments flooded with sympathy. Friends told her to stay strong, Strangers offered advice. Meanwhile, the county tax office portal still flashed red. The bills weren't going anywhere. The house wasn't a prize, it was a project. 60 years old, foundation cracks, spider webbing under the floors, a roof begging to collapse, systems groaning under deferred maintenance. I'd held it together silently, thanklessly, for a year, and now Claire thought she'd inherited a crown. What she got instead was a crumbling kingdom with rotten walls and debt woven into every corner. And I wasn't going to patch it up for her. That was her job now. And she hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The next morning, Claire dressed like a CEO, about to ring the opening bell. White blazer pressed crisp designer heels that pinched her steps, hair curled with the kind of precision that screams overcompensation. Darren trailed half a pace behind her, carrying a slim leather folder like he was her assistant instead of her fiancé. They walked into the bank expecting a coronation. What they got was a reckoning. The banker didn't bother with pleasantries. She slid a file across the counter. Page after page of overdue notices, property taxes flagged, insurance cancellations, deferred maintenance liens. Even a line item for a structural loan Grandpa had taken years ago, one Claire had never heard of. Claire's smile faltered on the first page. By the third, she wasn't breathing. The banker's tone was clipped, almost bored. Unless the balance of $49,200 is resolved within 30 days, the property will move into foreclosure review. Darren leaned forward, voice rising with every word. There's been a mistake. We were told everything was clear. We're the new owners. This paperwork is wrong. The banker didn't flinch. The account was quietly stabilized by a third party up until last month. Payments ceased. Liabilities remain. I knew exactly which month she was referring to, the one where I'd pulled the last safety net. Claire sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap. I wasn't there, but I didn't have to be. I could picture it. The way her face would drain of color, the way she'd cling to silence while Darren sputtered, the way she'd glance at her phone as if waiting for someone, me, to swoop in. But I didn't swoop anymore. That afternoon, my phone lit up like a slot machine. 4 missed calls from Claire, 3 from Darren, 1 clipped voicemail from Mom. Bella, your sister's at the bank. They're saying things that don't make sense. Call me back. Not, are you okay? Not, what's happening? Just, Claire's upset. Fix it. I didn't return the call. Instead, I poured myself coffee, sat by the window, and waited. By evening, Claire's fury found me. She finally caught me off guard between meetings. You set me up, she hissed the second I answered. You knew the house wasn't covered. You knew about the liens. You let me take the fall. I didn't raise my voice. You wanted ownership. You pushed for it. You signed behind my back. This is what ownership looks like. You're evil, she spat. You think this makes you the bigger person? No, I said evenly. It makes me free. She hung up, and 5 minutes later, she posted a blurry photo of a wine glass on Instagram. Caption: Betrayal. Snakes in the grass. Comments poured in. Friends telling her to stay strong. Strangers offering sympathy. None of them knew the truth. None of them saw the red flags flashing on the county tax portal. But I did, and I let them keep flashing. 2 days later, Dad called. His voice was steadier than Claire's, but there was an edge I hadn't heard before. Less arrogance, more calculation. Bella, he said, I think things have been exaggerated. Maybe if you could step in, just temporarily, to stabilize. I cut him off. I'm not involved anymore. Silence stretched. A full 10 seconds. Finally, he said, But this is your grandfather's home. Exactly, I answered. And you know what Grandpa would say if he saw what you let Claire do to it. He didn't argue. He just exhaled, low and hard, and hung up without a goodbye. That night, I found myself staring at the old photo on my desk. Grandpa standing in front of the porch with a hammer in one hand, the house rising solid and proud behind him. He knew houses weren't prizes. They were projects. They were work. And Claire had no idea what kind of work she'd just inherited. The foundation cracks, the roof, the deferred debts. She thought she'd won a crown. But all she'd taken was a collapsing kingdom. And she hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The following week, the cracks widened. Claire stopped posting brunch photos. Darren's social feeds went quiet, and then the texts started rolling in, from cousins, aunts, uncles. Messages wrapped in fake warmth. Thinking of you. How have you been? No one mentioned the house, but I knew why they were circling. Claire must have bragged about being the new owner. Now that the truth was leaking, they wanted to know what was really happening. But no one asked directly. They just hovered, waiting to see where the crown would fall next. The crown was already slipping. And the next person to knock on their door wasn't family. It was the contractor. The knock came on a Wednesday afternoon. Not the bank this time. Not another phone call they could dodge. A real knock at their door, steady, patient, unavoidable. It was Mark, the contractor Grandpa had hired years back to shore up the foundation. Claire had never heard of him. Darren probably assumed he was just another service guy, but I knew better. I'd been the one sending monthly checks to settle Grandpa's debt. Quiet, consistent, invisible. Until I stopped 3 months before the dinner. Mark stood in the doorway with a clipboard and an envelope. Calm, professional, the kind of man who doesn't bluff. There's still $14,000 owed on the foundation work, he said flatly. If it isn't resolved, I'll be filing the lien this week. Darren puffed up, ready to shout. That's impossible. This house is clear. We're the owners. Mark didn't raise his voice. He just pulled out copies of signed invoices, initials in Grandpa's neat handwriting, my own signature on later agreements. Evidence. Darren's protest died in his throat. Claire tried to stay composed, but her silence told the truth. She hadn't known. She hadn't prepared. She hadn't asked the right questions because she never thought she'd need to. Mark tucked the papers neatly back into his folder. You have until Friday, he said. Then he left. No threats, just certainty. I didn't hear about it from them. Of course not. I heard it from Mrs. Jensen, the neighbor who'd known Grandpa for 30 years and still called me now and then. She described the scene with relish, her voice equal parts pity and satisfaction. They look like deer in headlights, she said. Claire didn't even try to argue. Darren just sputtered like a teenager caught shoplifting. I thanked her, though she didn't need thanks. She already knew I hadn't been invited to dinner. She already knew I was the one holding the threads until I cut them loose. By the weekend, extended family started circling. Aunt Cheryl texted out of the blue. We should grab coffee sometime. Miss you. Uncle Leo sent a 2-line email. How are you holding up? Been thinking of you. No mention of the house. No direct questions. But I knew what they were fishing for. Claire must have boasted about inheriting Grandpa's estate. Word had spread fast when she thought she'd won. Now, with reality leaking through the walls, they wanted clarity without asking directly. I ignored most of them. Silence has its own power. Then came the HOA letter. Mixed in with utility bills and pizza coupons, it arrived in a plain white envelope. Claire didn't open it for weeks. She never opened anything that looked boring or official, but when she finally did, the damage was already done. 3 violations. Unauthorized structure in the backyard. Non-compliant electrical modifications. Failure to submit paperwork for architectural review. Each one traced back to Darren's brainchild, the hideous second-hand hot tub he'd installed himself. He'd poured concrete for the base without permits, wired it to an outdoor outlet with a chain of extension cords, and covered it with a tarp weighed down by bricks. The fine was already over $3,200. If they didn't remove it and restore the yard, the HOA threatened legal action. The letter was signed by Baker, the HOA president, a woman Claire had insulted loudly at a neighborhood event 2 months earlier, mocking her cheap shoes in front of half the block. So when Baker's name appeared at the bottom of the notice, it wasn't just procedural, it was personal. That week, neighbors reported seeing flashlights moving through the backyard at night. The HOA's inspector, documenting every violation. Mrs. Jensen called me again, whispering like she was narrating a thriller. They're circling the house with clipboards, she said. It's like watching sharks in water. I almost felt bad. Almost. But the truth is, Claire had turned Grandpa's legacy into a circus. Darren had turned it into a liability. And Mom and Dad had let it happen because it was easier to believe their golden child than to ask the quiet one for the truth. By then, Claire had gone silent on social media. No more curated brunch shots. No more filtered sunsets. Just a void. Darren's Facebook was dead too. But behind the silence, the walls were closing in. The lien, the fines, the foreclosure letters piling up. And still, not one of them called to apologize. Not one of them admitted they'd pushed me out for this. Instead, they circled the wagons, whispering, scrambling, pretending it could be salvaged. But I knew what was coming. Because Claire had been playing at ownership. And the first rule of ownership is this. When the bills come, the crown doesn't shine. It strangles. Claire was the one who asked for the meeting. That alone told me how far she'd fallen. She chose a cafe just outside town. one of those minimalist places with reclaimed wood counters and cold brew served like wine. I arrived 10 minutes early. She was already there. No makeup, hair pulled back into a messy bun, hoodie instead of a blazer, no jewelry. She looked smaller, like the shine had been stripped away. Her phone sat face down on the table, screen lighting up every few minutes with notifications she ignored. She didn't waste time. "I can't handle it," she blurted the moment I sat down. I stayed quiet, letting her fill the silence. The liens, the HOA, the taxes, everything's falling apart. Darren's barely around. Mom and Dad don't know what to say anymore. Her hands twisted the paper napkin until it shredded in two. I don't have the money. I don't even know where to start. I watched her carefully. She wasn't performing this time. There were no crocodile tears, just exhaustion. Then she dropped the real confession. "There was another fund," she said, voice low, like the words themselves were contraband. "Grandpa set it up years ago. Maintenance money. Dad told me about it after the house was transferred. Said it was for emergencies. I drained it." I raised an eyebrow. "How much?" Her eyes flicked down. "Almost everything. 6,000 on a shopping trip in LA, a vacation for a friend's birthday, spa memberships, designer clothes I thought I needed. It's gone." I didn't flinch. I already knew. 2 weeks earlier, the bank had flagged the account during their review. I'd seen every transaction, knew the dates, the stores, even the joint purchases with Darren's card. I'd been waiting to see if she'd admit it. She stared at me now like she was hoping for mercy. "I'll sign the house back to you," she whispered, "if you want it. I can't do this anymore." I didn't answer right away. I just sipped my coffee and let her squirm. Because what Claire didn't know was that there wasn't just a second fund. There was a third. After Grandpa died, months before the house became a battlefield, I'd received a letter from his private attorney. Separate from the family's lawyer, separate from the estate executor, a letter written in his own careful script. Inside was information about a fund in my name only. Quiet, untouched, locked until the property inevitably fell back to me. At the bottom, in his handwriting, were 5 words. "You'll know when it's time." I hadn't touched it, not yet, but knowing it existed gave me a calm Claire couldn't understand. So I told her the only thing she could hear. "I'll think about it." I let her sit in silence for a week. During that time, everything accelerated. The bank filed its final notice. The lien from Mark became official. The HOA added another $900 in fines. Mrs. Jensen called me one night, her voice hushed like she was reporting a crime. I saw Darren with a rented U-Haul, middle of the night. He was loading boxes, electronics, tools, maybe one of Grandpa's dressers. It didn't surprise me. Darren was the kind of man who would siphon off the last scraps before the ship went under. Claire stayed in the house, but her calls to me stopped. Maybe she thought silence was power. Maybe she thought it would scare me into swooping back in. It didn't. 2 days later, Mom broke. She sent me a text that looked like it had been written through tears. We didn't know everything. She lied to us too. I didn't reply, because she hadn't lied to them. She'd shown them who she was, and they chose to believe anyway. By the time Sunday came, I decided it was time to see it for myself. I drove up the long driveway in my battered Honda, parked behind Claire's Lexus, which hadn't moved in 5 days, and rang the bell. She answered in pajamas, hair greasy, eyes hollow. She didn't argue when I asked to walk through. She just stepped aside. The living room was chaos. Empty wine bottles, piles of unopened mail, dust gathering in corners. The kitchen was worse. Food rotting in the sink, ants by the fridge, the faint smell of mildew. The backyard still held Darren's hot tub, half drained, tarp sagging under bricks. But it was Grandpa's study that made me stop. Nothing had been touched. His books, his coin collection, his journals, and behind the cabinet, the old safe, the one Claire didn't know existed. I opened it. Inside were documents, letters, a flash drive. I'd been through it before, but this time I pulled out the folder labeled in Grandpa's handwriting, "Rebuild." Inside were notes on contractors, sketches for renovations, lists of trusted contacts, even savings plans. It wasn't just a house he left me, it was a roadmap for restoration. At the bottom was a note I hadn't noticed before, his handwriting again. "If they try to take this house, let them. People like that never hold on for long. And when they let go, you'll be here, just like I always knew you would." I closed the folder slowly. Claire stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes red. She whispered, "Do you want the house back?" I looked around the study, the one room she hadn't managed to poison. Yes, I said finally. I'll take it. She didn't argue, didn't bargain, just nodded. I'll be out by the end of the week. I didn't believe her. And I was right. Claire said she'd be gone by the end of the week. She wasn't. Instead, what came first were the fights. Mrs. Jensen called me one night, whispering, like she was reporting to a dispatcher. Claire was in the driveway screaming at Mom. Darren pulled up in his truck, neighbors with phones out filming as boxes flew. The cops eventually came, not to arrest anyone, just to shut everyone up. 2 days later, the Lexus finally disappeared. Claire didn't hand me the keys. She didn't call. She didn't knock on my door. She sent 3 photos instead, one of the front hall, one of the kitchen, one of the living room. Underneath, one word, done. No punctuation, no apology. I drove up that evening, parking in the same spot Grandpa used to. The blinds were crooked, the porch sagged with a black trash bag split open. They'd left the front door unlocked. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Stale, sour, humid, like old laundry mixed with spilled liquor. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled like what was left after a party no one wanted to clean. Lights were still on in half the rooms, fans spinning lazily overhead, cabinet doors gaping open as if someone had tried to pack and quit halfway. The living room was a wreck. Empty bottles, scattered mail, dust gathering like sediment. The carpet carried dark stains I didn't want to identify. The kitchen was worse. Food molding in the sink, ants crawling in jagged lines along the counters. A smashed mirror leaned against the wall as if thrown and forgotten. Upstairs, cigarette burns dotted the carpet. A drawer had been vandalized with marker. Sloppy words I didn't bother to read. In the garage, I found an old mattress covered in ash. Looked like someone had been smoking there for weeks. Next to it, a broken television. Glass spidering out on the concrete. Darren's weights sat in a heap, rusting. But it was Grandpa's study that stopped me cold. His books still lined the shelves, his journals stacked neatly on the desk, the coin collection in its case, dusty but intact, as if the room itself had resisted the rot. One of Grandpa's framed certificates had been knocked to the floor, glass cracked. I picked it up, brushed the dust away, and set it back on the shelf. The house had been defaced, but not destroyed. I spent the next 3 days cleaning, alone. 11 trash bags filled, dragged to the curb. A junk removal service came late and left early, the driver cracking jokes while hauling out Darren's busted electronics. I power washed the patio until the concrete looked new. I cut apart the hot tub, piece by piece, and left it at the curb. I scrubbed until my arms ached, until my knuckles were raw. In the kitchen drawer, I found receipts Darren had stashed. Expensive supplements, seekers he never wore, gadgets still in boxes. Claire's closet held almost nothing. Just a crumpled box labeled winter stuff, with scarves and a half-used candle. It was petty sabotage, not to make money, just to humiliate. But they couldn't touch what mattered. They couldn't touch the memory of summer nights on the porch, Grandpa's voice echoing in the hall, the creak of the floorboard outside his room, the chipped spot of paint he repainted every year and laughed when it peeled again. Those things were still here, waiting. On the 4th day, I opened the safe again, pulled out the folder Grandpa had labeled in his careful handwriting, Rebuild. I spread the papers across the desk, lists of trusted contractors, sketches for repairs, notes about the roof, the foundation, the plumbing. Each page a plan for the future he wouldn't live to see, but wanted me to carry. At the bottom, the letter I'd found last week. If they try to take this house, let them. People like that never hold on, and when they let go, you'll be here, just like I always knew you would. I read it twice, then folded it carefully, sliding it back into the folder. By the weekend, I'd made calls, quiet ones, to the contractors Grandpa had worked with before, men who still remembered his name. They came to walk the property. One ran his hand along the cracked plaster and said softly, "Your granddad was a good man." Another tapped the porch railing and promised to restore it the way it used to be. The house wasn't gone. It was waiting. For the first time since Grandpa died, I felt movement forward. The bad energy had left with the Lexus, with Darren's U-Haul, with Claire's hollow promises. The house had a heartbeat again, and it was mine. The first weeks were a blur of dust and paint fumes. Contractors came and went, their boots leaving clean prints on freshly swept floors. They patched the drywall, replaced the busted tiles in the kitchen, pulled up the stained carpets upstairs. They cleaned the vents, flushed the mildew from the air, and by the time the last crew left, the smell of rot had lifted. The blinds were replaced. the scuffed walls repainted. Even the porch swing Grandpa built was fixed, its chains steady, its wood polished back to a glow. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but for the first time since his death, the house felt alive again. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce anything to the family. I just let the silence stand. Still, news traveled. Mrs. Jensen stopped by with coffee one morning, her smile soft and knowing. "It looks like him again," she said, nodding toward the house. Then, with a conspiratorial lean, she added, "I hear Darren's couch surfing. Claire's with one of his friends across town." She didn't hide her satisfaction. But what she said next made me pause. "Your father tried to sue her," she whispered. "Over the Lexus, over the so-called renovations. She blocked him. Your mother cut ties with both of them. Nobody's speaking anymore." The empire they thought they'd built had crumbled in less than 3 months. I thanked Mrs. Jensen, though I didn't need confirmation. I'd already sensed it. Their silence wasn't strategy anymore. It was collapse. 2 days later, a courier arrived. Manila envelope, formal seal, my name printed in neat block letters. Inside was a final document from Grandpa's private law firm. I sat at the study desk, hands trembling as I unfolded it. The third account, the one Grandpa left only to me. There was a clause I hadn't seen before. If the house returned to my control, and if all debts were cleared, the remainder of the account would convert, not for the property, but for me. A private inheritance fund, untethered, free. Enough to cover more than the repairs, enough to live, to invest, to start something of my own. Grandpa hadn't just planned for me to hold the house together. He'd planned for me to reclaim it, restore it, and then move forward without it chaining me. He hadn't left me a prison. He'd left me a key. At the bottom of the document was a single line, written in his hand: "Protect what matters, but don't forget to live." I pressed my fingers to the ink. It felt like he was still here, nudging me on. That evening, I stood on the back porch with a glass of wine, the sun setting through the trees he planted 50 years ago. The air was quiet except for the faint tinkling of wind chimes he'd hung from the oak out back. They hadn't rung in years. Now they did. Not loud, just enough. The sound was clear, like a promise carried on air. I thought about Claire, somewhere across town, angry and broken, blaming everyone but herself. I thought about Darren, drifting, pawning scraps from a life he never earned. I thought about my parents, humiliated into silence, probably replaying every moment they'd chosen her over me. And I thought about Grandpa, who had seen all of this coming long before I did. He'd trusted me, not to be perfect, not to be invincible, but to endure. And I had. The house was mine again, but so was my life. No more being the quiet one who cleaned up after everyone else. No more pretending loyalty was the same thing as love. No more shouldering debts that weren't mine to carry. I had choices now, real ones. Travel, build, live. I looked at the chipped paint on the porch rail, the same spot Grandpa had repainted every summer. I smiled. I'd leave it chipped. Let it breathe. Not everything needed to be covered up. The house stood, stronger than the people who tried to claim it, stronger than the lies that nearly broke it. And as the wind chimes swayed, their song soft against the dusk, I knew this much was true. The legacy wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine.